Hi all, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to answer an essay question in definitions of abnormality. And this can feel quite challenging because the way that we answer definitions of abnormality questions are different to what you have seen previously. So they are different to how we would work in approaches, for example. They are different to how you'd work in social influence, mainly because there's usually studies that you can relate to and you can use them to describe and get some of your AO1s, and you can evaluate them and use that to get some of your evaluation. In definitions of abnormality, that just doesn't exist. So what we need to do to evaluate the strengths and criticisms of the different definitions themselves, and to give different examples of how abnormality can be used. And this is a slightly different approach. It's not beyond you at all, but it is slightly different, and this can make people feel a little bit unsure. So I'm going to talk to you about it very briefly. If you are not quite so confident about tackling the essay straight away, then I do recommend having a go at the little question, which is to define one definition of abnormality and explain one limitation. Essentially what you're doing with that is that you're going to be repeating that same sort of structure throughout the essay. So if you want to give that a little go first and build your confidence up, that is a really good place to start. Otherwise, we're going to talk about abnormality. It's very difficult to define. It can be hard to decide where normal behaviour ends and abnormal behaviour begins. Discuss 2 or more definitions of abnormality for 12 marks. So a brief reminder about what we're looking for in this. So in year 12, you tend to get 12 marks. In year 13, you will get 16 marks, I'm afraid. But for now, it's a half and half split. So AO1 is 6 marks, and that is about knowledge, that's definitions, etc., etc. And AO3 is evaluation. So strengths and weaknesses, and in this case, it is application of examples. So the main thing about this question is deciding on whether you want to go for breadth or depth. So what do I mean by that? So breadth is where we take a couple of definitions, so 3 or 4. Obviously we only have 4, so you can go for all 4 if you want to, and you define and evaluate them very, very briefly. So only taking a couple of AO1s each, or just even one AO1 if you're going for all 4, and then only evaluating them with 1 or 2 points. Or you can go for the depth option, which is to choose 2 of them and define and evaluate them with lots of different points. This obviously works quite well if you are quite confident in one of the definitions. I know a lot of you like deviation from social norms, for example, so you could always go for that approach and just make sure that you define and evaluate them in a little bit more depth. So that is kind of your 2 choices there. We have to go for 2 or more because it says in the question, discuss 2 or more definitions of abnormality. So one of the examples I've got here for you is statistical infrequency. People don't tend to go for this one very much, and I don't really understand why, because statistical infrequency has lots of really good evaluation points that you could use. So for example, for defining it, statistical infrequency refers to behaviours that are infrequent or considered to be rare, and this definition works by knowing what the typical values are, and it defines abnormality as those which fall out of those limits. A major strength of this definition that it is the only definition which is objective. This means that it defines abnormality without bias and uses data to strengthen its argument. The other way of expanding that point could be it is objective, unlike deviation from social norms, unlike deviation from ideal mental health, whichever way you want to go for it. I chose to just expand and explain why it was objective. As a result, this definition is considered to be scientific and provides evidence for abnormality which we can use in diagnosis. So again, I'm saying that it's scientific and I'm explaining why it's scientific. You could also compare that and be like, it's considered to be scientific, unlike deviation from social norms, whichever way you want to go for it. However, a disadvantage of this is where we draw the line on what is normal or abnormal. As for some things like depression, this is unclear. So essentially what I want you to do is think about that graph. So the normal distribution graph, and essentially statistical frequency is the 2 ends. It's not the hump in the middle. The hump in the middle is the normal bit, and then the 2 extremes are the abnormality. But we have to try and decide which bits are the abnormal bits. So trying to decide a cutoff point can be very difficult, especially for things like depression, which are obviously subjective anyway, in terms of a disorder, because we can't tell people how they feel. So therefore it's always going to be a little bit unclear as to what's normal and abnormal. And then the last point is that some behaviours are infrequent and therefore abnormal according to this definition, but are desirable. One example of this is high intelligence. And this is a unique point to statistical infrequency in that, we are essentially defining things as abnormal through, does it occur lots or does it not occur very much? And some things don't occur very much, so things like high intelligence, certain attractive, like feature-wise attractiveness, etc., etc. But sometimes they're desirable, so it's kind of like, it's abnormal, but it's not necessarily bad. So that's kind of keep in mind as well. So I just wanted to show you how this would look in terms of me marking it. So the red points refer to AO1, so I would have given this 2 AO1s because of its expansion on the definition there, and it would have got about 4 AO3s. There's lots of AO3s in here, partly because they're expanded, because they're explaining what's objective, what does it mean by scientific. So the whole point of evaluating is that you make the point and you explain why. So I know that Ms. Cook talks about gravy, for example, and expanding the points in that respect, and that is exactly the same principles. I just don't like acronyms, so therefore I don't use them. So evaluation for me is just you make the point and you explain why it's there. So that section would have been about 6 marks, which is quite high. So what I want you to do now is to go away and plan out your essay so that we can do it under time conditions. First thing for you to decide is whether you're taking a breadth or a depth approach. You need to decide on which definitions you want to use. So for some of them you can expand them much more easily. So Jehoda's characteristics, if for example from the deviation from ideal mental health, you could talk about those and that would expand your AO1 really, really nicely. And also the AO3s you want to use. So for example you could talk about them being subjective. All of them apart from statistical infrequency are considered to be subjective, but you have to tell me why. You can't just say it's subjective. Why is it subjective? Tell me. But for example, failure to function adequately can only use Harold Shipman as an example as to why that definition doesn't identify abnormalities. That he murdered many people, but he was never considered to be abnormal. So therefore, failure to function adequately doesn't define his abnormality, because he looked like he was a completely normal doctor, but in reality he was murdering people. So some of these examples are very specific to definitions and some of them are very general. The important thing is taking the relevant ones and applying them correctly. So have a little go. You can either use you can use the people around you if you want to make a plan together. You can just do it individually, but please do make a plan, and we're going to try and do this under time conditions and to help you practice for your upcoming mocks and such. Okay, so I hope that's been helpful, and I will hopefully see you soon. Cheerio.